What happens when that large funder suddenly says no? Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the fundraising school, and I'm joined today by Ann Fitzgerald. Ann leads AC Fitzgerald Consulting, and we're so delighted, Ann, to welcome you back to the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Thank you. Delightful to be here again, Bill. Thank you.
And we also like to point out that Ann is an alumna of the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, where she earned her master's degree. So, Ann, big news at the start of 2025, when the federal government announced instantly that federal funding was going to be paused. That raises the question of what happens when a nonprofit is highly dependent, some might say overly dependent, on any one funder. It could be the government at the federal, state, or local level. It could be a large foundation, a corporation, an individual. But it really called attention to so many nonprofits saying, wait, that's the bulk of my funding that's suddenly going away. You are consulting on behalf of nonprofits across the United States. What advice do you have for nonprofits in that situation?
Well, you're absolutely right, Bill. I think the big challenge, many nonprofits, and we see this all the time, whether it's federal funding or some other one source of funding, they could be reliant on 80, 90% or more of their funding from one single source. And of course, the challenge, if that money is ever in jeopardy, what that means for their programs and their staff. So I'd like to share some short-term things that organizations should think about and also some longer-term things. But I'd like to frame it up with the 3 R's, and it's not reading, writing, arithmetic, but be resilient, be realistic, and reach. So we need to be resilient, and we've had that experience, of course, most recently with the COVID pandemic. We've had to pivot, we've had to deal with these things. So this isn't a time to panic. And we also know that the philanthropic outlook for 2025 is strong. So that's a thing that we should be cognizant of and also take advantage of. We need to be realistic with our budgets, with our programs and our expenditures, because this could be a time where we will have some challenges. And finally, we need to reach, and we need to reach to our board, to our staff, to our communities, and possibly other funding sources in order to get through this crisis.
And I'd like to amplify a bit on resilient for just a moment. In our crisis fundraising curriculum at the fundraising school, which emanated out of the COVID pandemic, we look at the evidence-based practices that the leader needs to be able to gather the team, let everybody know what their roles are in these meetings that are responding to the crisis, in this case, an immediate loss of a very large funder. And then we start with facts, not with opinions, not with perceptions, but we lay the facts out. And once all the facts are available, then each person can provide their analysis. Once that analysis is in place, then we look at scenario planning, not just one way out, but multiple options depending on the changing landscape. And these decisions need to be provisional, meaning if we're wrong, we can reverse course, or if new information becomes available, we can change course. And it seems to me that's another example of being resilient, that we can become emotional, we can be fraught, but the people being served by our nonprofits, they're depending on us to get through this crisis.
Absolutely. And that data aspect is very critical. That's why we talk about the assessment of your financial place, and also thinking about what are some of the strategies. Sometimes you have to start rethinking your budget, saying, what's the worst case scenario budget? If we had to make some tough calls and make some cuts, what would they be that would still allow us to effectively carry out our mission? I think this is also a time to think about activating and reaching out to your vendors. Because, right now, cash is king. You want to preserve as much cash as possible. So taking a look at your vendors and seeing if they will consider pausing on some bills or taking a longer time where you have more time to pay them off, that might be something that might help you in the short term.
And I was leading a nonprofit in September of 2008 when Lehman Brothers crashed and took the rest of the U.S. and world economy with it. And we had the Great Recession. And that happened on a Sunday night. I remember on Monday morning, I contacted the finance committee chair of my board, and we sat down and we started to plan how we were going to respond. And by the end of that week, we had done just that, spoken with the financial institution, looked at our budget, announced some budget cuts. Fortunately, we didn't have to have any layoffs, but it was a six-figure budget rescission that we had to go through. What is the role of the board in this? We're talking to fundraisers and as they're working with their CEOs. But again, when there's this big announcement, whether again it's something in the economy, private foundation, individual donor, or in early 2025, that brief announcement from the federal government, what's the role of the board?
Your board has a fiduciary responsibility to the organization, and this is really go time for the board. So calling the board together to inform them, but also seeing what they can bring to the plate and helping to address this challenge. And this could be one thing they could think about is their own personal giving. Are there ways in which they could make a special gift or advance a pledge or help in some other way? Can they reach out to their own networks and see if they can also help supplement some of your income? So we're looking for them for their guidance, of course, but also some very specific things that maybe they can do in the short term to shore up some of your revenue.
And when folks are being realistic, they want your 3 Rs, and talking with their vendors, talking with their board, looking at their budget, there may be some fundraisers hesitant to go to other donors. To feel like, oh, we're going to look like we're unprofessional, like we hadn't done our homework, like now we're unreliable. But as my predecessor, Tim Seiler, said at the beginning of COVID, if your fundraising case for support was strong before the crisis, it's strong and even stronger during the crisis. Do you see that hesitancy in the nonprofits that you work with, that they might be embarrassed or feel that they're going to be viewed as not doing their job very well? How do you encourage them to be confident with their fundraising case for support?
Well, I think that's true. Sometimes people are hesitant, but the reality is these are people, and especially your donors who have been loyal to you, that hopefully you've been communicating with regularly. And of course, they're seeing what's going on in the world. I think getting out in front and communicating them rapidly, not waiting, and letting them know this is what we're facing. And we hope, just like we reach out to the board members, we hope that the donors would consider a special gift to help at this time. They can be part of the solution, part of encouraging and continuing your mission. So I think it's more of they're coming along as partners, we're not going to them hat in hand because we've done something wrong. We just have to change our mindset a little bit.
Well, Ann, thank you for your guidance on some of those short-term issues that nonprofits need to deal with. Let's think about long-term. First of all, there's this immediate situation, the pause in federal funding that was brief, certainly sent a signal that if that doesn't happen, surely the budget writers throughout 2025 are going to have this philosophy in mind, and that could wind up in the budget heading into 2026. So if I'm a nonprofit heavily dependent on federal funding, I would think my long-term planning needs to be responsive to that possibility. What other suggestions do you have, again, on this concept of over-reliance on one funding source? That funding source goes away or might go away. How, as a nonprofit, can I build my long-term budget strength?
Well, first, I would look at your operating reserve. An operating reserve is literally money in the bank. So you want to begin to look at that and say, do we even have that? Can we start to build that? And a rule of thumb that I use is, can you put aside 10% of every undesignated dollar to start? So start building that reserve becomes critical. Secondly, I would really think very carefully about how well you're doing stewardship with your current donors, because you want to and need to retain as many of them as possible. And that's true short-term and long-term. So think about ramping up those stewardship and engagement efforts. And then I'd also look at, well, are we maximizing our other sources of revenue? It's very common for nonprofits to have a dominant giving source, and that can change over time, but we don't want to be so over-reliant that we're not looking at other opportunities. And as we know from Giving USA, that 85% of charitable giving, if you count in family foundations, comes from individuals. So we want to think about what are some of those other sources that maybe we've ignored, whether that's foundation grants or individuals or maybe even the corporate world. And one other thing I would mention, Bill, is that maybe two things, but one thing I would say is make sure you have a planned giving program as well. I know we always put that off because we don't feel like it's immediate money, but if we're talking long-term, having a planned giving program can be a real lifesaver, especially sometimes you can't plan when someone's going to pass away or you're going to receive a bequest, but it could be critical money that could go into your operating reserve. And then just as a final note, if you do not have a finance committee of your board or even an ad hoc committee, it might be time to form one so that you can begin that longer term planning for all things related to the nonprofit's finances.
And that is such wonderful wisdom and great guidance that fundraisers can utilize right away. To amplify Ann's point about the operating reserve, at the fundraising school, our curriculum actually teaches you how to do that. One way is you can actually move some of your indirect expenses into your direct program expenses. That can help you because donors really love to fund those programs directly and at the same time be building that reserve. And you say, well, how do I put aside 10%? Well, you put a line in your budget called operating reserve for your unrestricted dollars. You put a dime for every dollar into that line. You say you can't do a dime? How about a nickel? How about a penny? Start somewhere and grow it from there over time. Ann talked about stewardship. We've just added and strengthened our stewardship module in our principles and techniques course and have other curriculum on that topic. And also this importance of diversifying. And this is why the announcement by the federal government, really sent a lot of shockwaves through the U.S. nonprofit sector. We're about a $3 trillion sector, Ann, and government is 1/3 of that funding. Philanthropic fundraising is only 16% of that funding. Earned income is half, which again sends that signal to be strong. We need to be able to diversify. Now, I can't let you go before we go back to something you said early on, that you see a lot of promise for fundraising in 2025. What tea leaves are you reading? What sense are you getting that you have high hopes for strong fundraising across the board in 2025?
Well, I think I read somewhere once that several years ago that the end of the pandemic would happen in 2024. So I'm latching on to that. We're officially past it 100%. I think there's going to be some legislation this year that might impact taxes. And as we know, when people feel like they can invest more or the stock market goes up, people are more philanthropic. So I think there's some things to say that might point to a positive direction. And I feel like that's going to be something that we're going to see more of. Of course, anything can change, and it always does. But right now, it looks like it's a positive year for philanthropy.
And a couple more data points for us to consider. Our school's research on the wealth effect of giving shows that the biggest predictor is the S&P 500 the previous calendar year. Well, in 2024, the market gained 23%. In history, that has been a strong signal of positive fundraising the following calendar year, which would be 2025. Doesn't always happen, but it almost always happens. Second of all, our good friend Rick Dunham just came out with some research showing that donor confidence is at its highest level in the last 5 years. And the vast majority of donors expect to give as much, if not more, than they did the previous year. Now, daily events, national and world events can change everything. But again, as the start of 2025 is upon us, those are some flashing green lights to think about as we fundraise. But Ann, any final advice that you have? Because again, each nonprofit is different. Each subsector is different. Again, in light of that announcement in January that the funding was ending, or maybe I'm in a city with a huge fire, or maybe I'm in a city that just got hit by a hurricane, or the foundation said, sorry, we're changing our plans. What advice do you have for those nonprofits that, again, heavily reliant on one funder?
Well, I think getting your communications out there, this is a time to reach deeply into your communities, activate them if that's appropriate, but certainly inform them of what's going on. And then also look for other efficiencies where you can. If you can use volunteers to temporarily fill a position, that's great. And of course, we know about so many of the AI tools that are adding to the efficiency of our organization. You did a great podcast on that recently. And of course, the fundraising school has an excellent course about using AI in fundraising. So any of these tools we can latch on to increase our efficiency might help us in the short term and long term.
Ann Fitzgerald, the leader of AC Fitzgerald Consulting, a national fundraising and nonprofit leadership consulting firm. And always a delight to have you with us on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And so much of this content covered in our curriculum, 25 courses now leading to 5 different certificates in person in 10 U.S. cities, including Washington, D.C., and of course, online, either synchronous or asynchronous, live or recorded, in the United States and anywhere across the world. Now, we can bring these courses directly to you or parts of courses knit together into our custom training, again, nationally or internationally. We have quarterly webinars, these weekly podcasts, and all of our knowledge gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, the book now out in its 5th edition. Where do I find this? Well, I go online to go.iu.edu/TFRS for the Fundraising School. Grateful for our producers today, the Emmy Award winner Mike Anthony, as well as Jennifer Boffman, CFRM. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. Now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the Fundraising School.